Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is of course a strange music show, taking dives into the weird, wonderful world of music and all it has to offer, I feel. So in today's episode, we are returning to the world of Have a Nice Life, just shy of about 3 years, I guess, when we first discussed the entirety of Deathconciousness on the channel. So in today's episode, we're of course looking at the band's second full-length studio album, another presentation of the brutal anguish of existence, when one's mind is one's worst enemy, it feels, and there's nothing left to do but to keep pushing on in spite of everything, basically. Like, goodness, incredibly harrowing stuff, basically. But I do think it'd be worth discussing this particular album, as it's, to me, it's just as fascinating as its predecessor and has some of my absolute favourite songs by Have a Nice Life, Basically just offering up that same level of dark, intense, loud music, as well as some very abstract, just moody numbers that are just incredible, basically. So, without further ado, I present The Unnatural World by Have a Nice Life. So I believe we already answered who Have a Nice Life were on the video of Deathconciousness, but so we'll just skip that here. But let's instead ask, what is the Unnatural World? Well, this is the band's second studio album, following on from the release of Deathconciousness in 2008 and the EP release of Time of Land in 2010. The Unnatural World, released in 2014 on the Flesner and via the band's own record label of Enemies List Home Recordings. This kind of acts as a continuation of, what I'd argue are the same themes and sentiments as that were first explored in Deathconciousness. Coming across to me kind of like a hidden chapter within that same story, perhaps. And so the album, recorded between the years of 2008 to 2012 in various bedrooms between Connecticut and Massachusetts. As a result, it offers up more of that incredibly noisy, overwhelming gothic post-punk shoegaze style, all recorded with that same low-fi style that just adds so much, grit and fuzz to the already distorted and heavy instrumentals. It is once again another harrowing experience, one that just expresses the depths of depression, the misery of existence, and just the unbearable existentialism that just gets that I think arguably gets a bit darker than it did on the Deathconciousness sometimes. I think it's, to be fair, actually quite difficult to discuss, but at the same time, Have a Nice Life just seemed to tap in so perfectly into that part of the human experience, of just suffering and anguish, creating some of the most harrowing and cathartic music in the process. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So opening up with Guggenheim Wax Museum, we have a ghostly chorus echoing in the distance, an ambient eulogy that just opens up things so stark and bleakly before a sudden descent into the loud distortion just starts the whole thing off with overwhelming fuzz and noise. And you get those programmed drums, just establishing that slow, doomy tempo. And whilst, all the whilst, you've got this cataclysmic storm of noise, just clashing so ferociously before the lyric comes through with that tragically depressing drawl. In many ways, it's the exact kind of thing one would expect from Have a Nice Life, just that wonderful lo-fi sound contributing to this gorgeously bleak landscape. And the guitars just seem to rattle around with that fuzz and noise and distortion, I don't know whether it's from the effects of the lo-fi recordings and or from the pedals, or just, but whatever's happening, it just turns all of the notes in the guitar into this wonderfully loud, distorted sound. It is what I adore, though, it's incredibly loud music that feels so harrowing, this expression of the bleakest, darkest thoughts that our minds wander to when we're feeling most alone and isolated, essentially. And especially when you look at the lyrics and you see this expression, of what I would argue is being put to rest beneath the very earth itself, ending in this cry of wishing we were alive but realizing we never really were. Like, my goodness, it's such a harrowing sentiment, I have to say. And especially on that final word, the guitar just comes through with such a thinly strewn frequency of loud distortion that rattles through our very ears, leading the way for that miserable procession, letting the loud parts continue to overload before fading into those strands of distorted frequencies that eventually recede all the way back into silence. To me, this is a phenomenal opening track though, one that does that classic have a nice lifestyle thing in such a way that still retains that emotional intensity that makes the music so brilliant to hear. Dark and harrowing, but it is exactly what we are here for. So our next track of a Defenestration song, this one kind of brings us more back to that kind of manic fast-paced style that you get from the band on occasion, that style that borders almost on kind of like black metal at times, with the resounding quality of the band and the distortion of the guitars as well, this incredibly fast tempo provided by the drum machines, it just all contributes to this very overwhelming style that's so fast-paced. Once again though, this is just another classic depressing dirge of misery, that existentialism that comes through from just the sheer fact of existing, or still being alive despite the multitude of dark thoughts occurring over and over. I really like the pacing here though, and the way the guitars though just seem to ring through with these wonderful tones of distortion. The whole presentation of its tone is just something that feels like a very chilling experience. Distortion that overloads us from all angles, thrown right into the deep end as it feels like the darkness just threatens to break us, just to shatter us completely under the weight of everything. And there is this amazing intensity to it, coming across as one of the strongest tracks on the album, but just how ferocious and overwhelming it all is. But with that incredible level of distortion and noise that the guitars get to, I just find it to be so incredible. So much of this one, it feels like it's just overloading and just devolving into pure feedback, and it just lets that noise build and build to terrifying levels, all the while the drums just pounding away, just never letting go for even a second. It's very overwhelming, and it's so bleak, but it's what makes Have a Nice Live's music just so amazing and intense to listen to, what makes it so incredible. And as nervous and tense as the whole thing makes me feel, I find it to be so truly fascinating. To also further discuss this one, there's actually some words from both Dan and Tim regarding the rework of this track for this sophomore album release. So apparently, whilst the original was arguably a lot more minimalised, this version just seems to turn up the noise and throw in much more tension, Speaking on it, Dan and Tim said the following. I remember putting down an absurd number of guitar tracks for the re-recording. I really wanted to get that nervous, haunted sound that Rick Agnew did on Christian Death and Adolescent albums. Yeah, that's a total Christian Death part. Lyrically, I think it has to do with feeling like an unhappy state of being is somehow the core component of what and who you are. It's the worrying idea, the idea of having a nature. It is to me anyway. Kind of bleak and sad though, but I do completely understand what Dan is saying here, where when depression becomes so all-encompassing, it does feel like this is all you are, who you are at times, and something I can very oddly relate to. But it's incredible though, because you do have so much of that terrifying nervous energy coming through on this song, like all of the band's music, it's just so decidedly bleak, this existential look at the self, about what makes us who we are, and in this case, the unending misery and depression just being one of the core components of it down. My goodness, what a lot to take in, and we're only 2 songs into this thing. So, our next track of Burial Society. So this one opts for a greater presence of those of the electronic drums, this programmed loop sounding almost glitchy at times perhaps, and you get this piano accompanying this gathering storm of soundscapes. And when Dan sings though, my goodness, it is so sad and full of emotion here, especially when you get to the chorus, this agonizing confession of awareness that is of our own minds that creates these feelings within us. It isn't real, but it feels real. I get shivers every time I think of this line and confront it, because it's something that I really do connect with in a weird way. Something that I've been before, where we know what's happening isn't real, but the fact that your mind makes it feel so real is so much to deal with. I think it is, without a doubt, especially when you look at the lyrics, one of the most bleakest and depressing songs from the band. The absolute despair that's up there with the likes of, I Don't Love from Deathconciousness, perhaps. And I think it's perhaps the bleak honesty that comes through in the lyrics, as we're especially given the exact thought process of the suicidal, and it's brutal to hear, and something that just stuns me whenever I hear it, though. It's perhaps an example to me of how this album just further pushes the themes, of depressing existentialism, to this even bleaker place somehow. And those who have been there no doubt know, as it's a very difficult and weird thing to express, but it's so easy to understand if it's something you've experienced in any context, I would argue. And hearing it here, I just feel so broken, like I'm just unable to carry myself. But the experience of hearing that, of hearing this song, it's what I adore though, because there's such a cathartic release to it, if that makes any sense, that it just taps into the emotions that I so strongly feel. It's what I adore about their music though, the way that Have a Nice Life are just so easily able to tap into that part of their psyche and express it in a way that feels so brutal, yet so cathartic at the same time as well, That idea that we're not alone in these thoughts, and to be alive is this really weird fucking thing, right? I find it difficult to explain properly, truth be told, but the impact of what is being sung and expressed here, it makes me sick to my stomach almost in how I'm reminded so much of the same things. I'm also, the stuff that it confronts me when I'm hearing it, is just a lot to deal with. But at the same time, I'm comforted in that process as well. This sense of not being alone in these thoughts, expressed so brilliantly in this song, which is perhaps another highlight, albeit such a dark and harrowing one. I'm not really sure what else to say about it. It's a brilliant song for many reasons, and I find myself so drawn to the ending though, where all of that darkness is allowed to slowly taper off for such a long time. A final shot held off for ages on the final image, and that just stuns me. A song that hits like a ton of bricks, bringing me to the stark realization of the pain that it is to just exist, basically. It's weird, just to quickly try and mention it though, but it's difficult to word correctly why somebody would enjoy this, if that makes sense. I think enjoy is the wrong word, but it is essentially that thing, why would you choose to hear something like this if it's so much, basically? I think it's for me, it's because of that emotional resonance that embedded deep in the core of the music itself. That is disturbingly harrowing as it all becomes, there is this sense of solidarity that comes from experiencing it, right? Of a like-minded individual, in this case Dan and Tim of course, expressing it in a way that we can experience as art. In this case is music though, it's something to be heard though, of course, isn't it? But to so concisely condense the immense weight of disturbing thoughts, it's just a testament to how acutely the band is able to express it in their music. That we as listeners instantly know and understand what those feelings are like because we have been there ourselves. And it's interesting that some people, would class this kind of lyricism as just being edgy. I did see some comments of this, and whilst I would never condone anyone's opinion on anything, or try not to, I do feel like comments like these are coming from those who aren't connecting with it on that emotional level. Because it's not trying to be edgy, it's trying to be honest. And sometimes that level of honesty and vulnerability is not something that can easily be understood. Bit of a weird tangent, but with how raw this one is, I thought it was worth mentioning, to be fair. I think we should move on though. We get to the next track of Music Will Untune the Sky. So this one kind of opens up with a smouldering of sounds, before delayed, distorted guitars just rattle through with these great shrieks of sound, paving the way for this very odd low end of drone to just come through. And there's something delightfully shoegazy about this one. Just this massive wall of sound that drones away so fantastically before we get these really loud vocal drones from the band. singing these almost ceremonial chants, adding to that wall of noise before towards the end of the whole thing. You just get this very brief stanza of "I am the only one, I'm sorry, Lord." Like this brief moment of existentialism directed straight to God, it seems. This is something that actually cropped up on the previous album, of utilising religion as a lens for our own existentialism, of our confusion of existing, and in this case, apologising for it, which is, I get it. But it's amazing because in amongst the noise, though, it is all wonderfully indiscernible. You just get this constant building of drones and noise. The rattles of percussions rattling across the channels, and drones just ascending more and more, getting louder and louder and more unbearable as it threatens to just tear you apart. And although it's kind of a somewhat lengthy song in its own right, it's weird because it actually feels like a very oddly brief in amongst the entire experience that this album has been offering. Maybe just being this moment of existential respite situated right in the middle of this entire album. Very weird, but it's also kind of cool how it's all been structured this way, though, from the harrowing parts of the first track to leading into this big moment of, existentialism, like, perhaps viewing God themselves and just being broken apart by an entire experience of it, perhaps. But I just love how it all just builds up so wonderfully, so loud, and just that classic have a nice life style of just overwhelming noise. Truly brilliant.
You have just heard about Johnny. He's been causing discipline problems here at Penhurst, so they thought they would send him to Q2. We thought you would like to see where Johnny lives. Johnny, can you talk?
Yes.
Do you like it here at Penhurst?
No.
Why not, John?
There's...
Let me ask you this, John. Do you remember living anywhere except Penhurst?
No.
Do you like talking to the people up here?
Yeah.
Why, John?
And they like to talk to me.
How about the other kids, the ones that can talk? Do they like to talk to you too?
Yes.
Do you like to talk to them better than the kids up here?
Yes.
Have you been talking more lately or less?
Less.
Why are you here in Q2, John?
I did something where I wasn't supposed to be doing.
So they punished you and put you here?
Yes.
Do they do this all the time to you, John?
Yes.
Why are you here in Q2, John?
I did something where I wasn't supposed to be doing.
Why are you here in Q2, John?
The doctor had warned me that it would be bad.
I did something where I wasn't supposed to
There was
be
one
doing.
attendant who would have 50 severely and profoundly retarded children.
I did
The ones
something
that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands that are like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone, only one or two or three people to take care of 70 people in the ward, sharing the same toilet, contracting the same diseases. And it was every time. Every child can be trained, these kids. There's no effort. We don't know what kids are capable of doing. Now that you're my age, I think that you are very tired. Your classes that they produce are classes that you education provides a program for the schools and serve the daycare. For example, these kids can go to school at age 3 years. So they started very young, and that's pretty apparent.
So our next song is actually, perhaps one of my top favourite songs by Have a Nice Life. Most of them do seem to be, but this particular one is one of my favourites, Cropsey. So this one opens up with what sounds like a music box before we're given a very long sample of an interview with a child at the mental institution, basically. Johnny, answering about his experience at Penhurst. And this is a very harrowing opener, very honest, open and unsurprisingly bleak interview offset by the gentle twinkling of notes. A contrast of childhood music perhaps against the darker side of this young child perhaps who is experiencing just terror in this horrible place essentially. From there, As it all develops, it's slowly accompanied by a small quavering frequency hovering in place until the sample then falls into a bit of a loop, which then leads the way for a second interview to occur, an overview of the facility and the horrible conditions within. And as it sort of slowly builds in this way, you get this very odd sense of tension starting to occur, especially with the persistence of that drone, intensified even more when you get a faint drum pattern starting to appear before it all. And then as it builds and builds, it just all descends heavily into the song, this agonizing paean once more. Man, I don't know why, but this one just always gets to me. But like when you actually get to the song itself, I just find myself almost in tears about the whole thing though. Like this whole song just really gets to me. This painful struggle of existentialism, grappling with our own understanding of belonging. To be fair, Dan actually has a little bit to say about this song. He says the following in his own words. It has mostly to do with that vague sense of not belonging. That you're not supposed to be where you are. And if everyone finds out, it will all be over for you. I don't know why, but this one just seems to me just feels so agonising to hear. This brutal, stark, bleak understanding of feeling this way and how painful it is expressed in this constant refrain at the end of just waiting on everyone here. Like the way Dan says that line over and over at the end, and you just get the overloading, cataclysmic explosion of music at the same time. That overwhelming shoegaze drones and stuff and noise and fuzz. Oh, it just really gets to me. Just this expression of this existential experience of being pulled out of place and time completely, disconnected from all those around you, disconnected from everyone also existing in that same place and time. I think it's what makes it hit so much harder, is that kind of stark realism that comes through in the lyrics themselves. The way it's all been expressed to us, the anguish on the voice, the intensity of the instrumental, the distortion rising so loudly though, it just results in an experience that emotionally resonates with so many people. Those who hear it and understand just go, I know what you mean. I have felt that too. And it's what makes their music so cathartic, is that brutal honesty that comes from that genuine place of suffering and understanding. I do think it's perhaps actually rather abstract on this particular song, especially in respect to the incredible use of vocal samples at the beginning. It really expresses the darkness and anguish of the human experience and stuff, especially with the interview being this literal expression of the human experience, essentially. Those poor children in that horrible place, and as bleak and harrowing as it all is, it's easily one of my favourite tracks off this album. One of my top favourite songs by Have a Nice Life, but it is one that just breaks me every single time I hear it. We're going to move along to the next track of Unholy Life. So this one suddenly descends in with a very loud, distorted bass, almost similar to The Big Gloom, but instead of it launching off into a riff, we're actually given some very doomy notes here, before the guitar just comes clanging in alongside a very squelchy beat, caught in an array of lo-fi effects. And it's another loud banger of shoegazy notions that morphs into the kind of Joy Division post-punk sound whenever the guitar comes in, with this alarming clattering of singular notes repeated over and over. But then, it actually sort of turns into a sort of My Bloody Valentine level of noisy shoegaze. Just this loud banger that just feels like a fraction more uplifting as a result of how the instrumental sounds here. Odd to say in context of Have a Nice Life, but sometimes that music does have that sort of lifting quality to it. Although lyrically, just to contrast that, we do have another classic depressing existential exploration that comes through in all their songs. But it's just the tone of the instruments. It sounds a little bit more easygoing, especially in how it indulges in the loud, distorted noise that shoegaze offer. It makes for just something that just acts as a bit of, a bit of a sort of moment to sort of collect our thoughts after everything we've experienced. And I will be honest, I don't think it's one of my favourite tracks from the band. But I do appreciate its placement here on the album and what it does. It helps to bring the energy back following that really depressing dirge of misery and existentialism, letting us just thrash about for a few minutes before we dive right back in to finish off the whole album. And it is odd, because it does argue to feel a bit more joyous in some respects. Not happy joyous, but I don't know, this is a hard one to explain. It might be kind of like that agriculture level of ecstaticness, if that makes sense, bordering on it being uplifting, that reaching that same ecstatic wonder that, that music will untune the sky actually believes, actually, to be fair. It's weird because, but it just, especially with how it all sounds, that energy that's all put into it, it just seems to lift itself. So yeah, a bit of an odd, but I do appreciate how it helps the flow of the album by just pushing it back into the direction of the album. Odd, and I do find the song a bit tricky to remember in the grand scheme of things, but with its large expansive world of sound, it certainly fits very well here. A somewhat brief little dirge capturing that loud, noisy aesthetic. So our next track, Dan and Tim Reunited by Fate. Here we get another kind of post-punk style aesthetic here. A strange assortment of sounds accompanying the bass line, punctuated by that singular beat, until the anguished tragic voice comes through with the first lyric. And there's some very unusual effects happening here, all hidden in amongst the mixing of the track, creating a sense of uncertainty and tension whenever we hear it. But when it drops into the chorus, it is a sudden descent into that distorted guitar, like it just suddenly arrives like a colossal wave that seems to drown the voice in more reverb effects, just completely overthrowing and exhausting the entire thing. And as our penultimate song, there's almost this sense of exhaustion we're experiencing when we hear it. Like having gone through so much in this very short space of time, especially in context of Deathconciousness, which was a very long album being two discs. This one has made us go through so much in such a short space of time. And I feel like by this point we're just almost very drained by the very experience, which I think is actually part of what we're supposed to be feeling. Just that constant onslaught that depression puts us through. And it's interesting how midway through this song though, a lot of that noise seems to taper off though, following the line of "we don't know anything," letting the drum beat continue into these almost glitchy areas once again as we get this very strange soundscape over just a few bars. Interference and distortion coming through softly before you get these glides of guitar, this densely layered with distortion and delay. And with the way the guitar chords just seem to have this slight bend as well, it's a fascinating instrumental closer that seems like just wallowing in your own misery, of just being pushed along half of the chorus, dragged by the experience as the whole world just continues to drift by without a second thought here. Especially when you get this rising groan in amongst it though, it feels like being pushed further and further down and forces to experience the constant brutality of it. In some ways it is an odd song in some respects, but I do have great appreciation for it, as it seems to just perfectly continue the whole vibe and aesthetic that this whole album is presented to us, while still doing some things different and interesting here and there. And I have to say, I also really like the name here, which according to Barrett is a take on the Falcon fighting game Rival Schools United by Fate. I feel like there's actually a sort of element of humour here, but what I actually really like is the meta element you get from naming the song this. The unification of both Dan and Tim and their friendshipness, the like-mindedness in the form of the very band we are listening to. Also mentioned in the very booklet here as well, Have a Nice Life is, was, and always will be Dan and Tim. Like, to me, it just really cements their friendship and the bond that the both of them have in this, their shared experience and being this band together. And it's a bit odd to explain, but I did want to try and mention because I just think there's something very sentimental about it. And on an album that is as bleak and despairing as this, it's actually nice that they've put reference to this there as well. Now, of course, the song itself and the lyrics still express that bleakness, of course, but it's been named something that tells this slightly larger story, I feel. An odd tangent, but one I thought was worth mentioning all the same. And so, with the drone transitioning straight in from the, from the previous track, we end up at the final track here, starting with this quiet murmuring of the wind, where we get a sudden descent of drones from the keyboard, leading us right into the closer of Emptiness Will Eat the Witch. So I don't know why exactly, but this song alongside the Big Gloom from Deathconciousness is among my top favourite songs by Have a Nice Life. This minimalist drone of cathedral organs and ghostly voices echoing against this very slow, sparse, clean guitar line, punctuated by this even more sparse tapping sound. It just results in something I find to be so overwhelmingly bleak and despairing. It's odd as this track is sonically different to the kind of loud, noisy distortion we're probably more used to when it comes to the music of Have a Nice Life. But something about the way this one proceeds just connects with me on an emotional level, just forcing me to hang my head low, curl up in the corner, and just give up and let go, basically. And this song just slowly pushes itself along like a very slow, ethereal funeral march, with the lyrics fascinatingly, self-reflecting on the very process of creating music to help guide and manage our experiences of depression, culminating in this noisy deluge of who am I to point it out? You are no one. And it's that kind of thought process that the depths of depression can lead you to, of imposter syndrome, which has cropped up a bit on this album already, of self-doubt and wondering what the point of even all of this is anyway if you're still just going to feel this way. And with the way we just get so many repetitions of you are no one, just all colliding in amongst another towards the end though, and the rising drones just getting louder and louder, it just becomes another wall of sound that envelopes you in this incredibly dark, cathartic experience. I find myself just so broken by this point though, by the experience, by the way in which this perfectly captures that sense of despair, brokenness and pure emptiness. It's why I adore this track, which is really weird because it's so sonically different to that loud crushing distortion that you get from Have a Nice Life, especially when we actually compare it to the previous closer on Deathconciousness of Earth Mover, which was such a loud and long track, but one of the loudest as well that you just headbang along to. This one you just hang your head low to. And I feel like it's perhaps almost mirror imaging it in some respects, capturing the same aesthetics in different contexts. Funnily enough, I wrote my thoughts down this and then found out this was actually intentional, as Dan and Tim did mention the following in regards to this song. It was one of the earliest we had completed while working on the album. Over time, as the rest of the material took shape, we felt that ending the album on a note of meditative uncertainty might be more appropriate, aesthetically and narrative-wise, than driving toward complete exhaustion like Earth Mover did. Right, partially it was about not ending on a blowout, almost a mirror image of our first record. But yes, I do, it does make you feel that the Unnatural world just follow on so fittingly from Deathconciousness, acting like, a later chapter further along in that same story. And seeing them, that there was this careful consideration to how to make this track end in just the right way, this album end in just the right way, a direct contrast to Earth Mover's crushing, distorted density. Here we have this ambient wall of minimalism, droning away as the voices hauntingly sing over like ghostly choirs. It really expands upon the sonic world building of Have a Nice Life sound, showcasing these more ethereal ambient sides that partner up so comfortably with the loud, noisy shoegaze parts. But the core of it all is just this unrelenting despair and misery, this unyielding depression running through each and every song, the very thread that ties all of the band's music together. And so how would you even begin to summarize something like this? It is fascinating to me with the way Deathconciousness is so revered by so many out there. The Unnatural world is interesting that it is arguably overshadowed in a bunch of respects, which I do understand, dwarfed by the colossal experience that is the double album of Deathconciousness. But as it stands, I do find the Unnatural world to be just as impactful, if not more so in places. Very hard for me to explain though, but I just feel that on this one, everything is even more broken and despaired, even less able to carry itself through the absolute soul-shattering misery to the point where serious consideration is given to some of those darkest thoughts. It did certainly rear its head numerous times on the last albums, but here, after all this time, still being at the absolute lows of lows, I don't know why, but I find it oddly enough to be even more devastating. Maybe it's because it's that navigation of mental health, the continuing story of just existing, grappling with existentialism, finding ourselves in even darker corners. I'm just floored by the whole experience. I do want to add as well, I don't think I'm here to really say that I think Deathconciousness or Unnatural World is better. Rather, I just specifically wanted to discuss this album that I really like for its own reasons. And it is interesting coming back to Have a Nice Life and looking at their other albums, you know. This is one that has always had such an impact upon me, you know, with Cropsey and Emptiness Will Eat the Witch being some of my most played songs. Like, I cannot fathom how many times I've wandered down the streets, you know, listening to Emptiness Will Eat the Witch on my headphones, carrying the weight of an exhausting day's work and just wallowing in the despair and misery of it all. Something about it is just so cathartic to me, which is, you know, I believe one of the most important elements of Have a Nice Life music. That sense of catharsis resonating within you, it's what makes the music feel so important to me. It is weird, definitely, but that's the point of this show as well, I feel. Examining that strange relationship we have with music, or I do, I guess in the context of what I'm literally saying here, isn't it? Emotional resonance, as I always say, especially in a devastating context, is something I find fascinating in music. It's something I'm always interested in exploring, and for some reason interested in expressing to you, the audience, for some reason. I don't really know why, but I just really find it interesting making these particular episodes for some reason. You know, I don't know if it's going to make all that much sense to many of you watching, but maybe it does. Maybe not, who knows. Not everything does. But I know that regardless of all else, this album does resonate with me and does make sense to me and does connect on that emotional level that I really do understand and get to, because I've been there myself as well, as hard as it is to discuss. So I think with that we will come to the end of our episode Weird Music. I'm very glad to have finally taken the time to return to one of my favourite bands. Now, it's been a long time since we first discussed Deathconciousness, and I did always plan to eventually do this follow-up, but alas I never got around to it until now. It is a difficult one to properly discuss though, as the brutality and anguish is just almost unbearable at times. But nobody does it quite like Have a Nice Life. Easily one of my favourite bands of all time, and although I don't do the best job at talking about it, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to at least try in the form of these strange music reviews. Explanations of my experience in music. For who? Who knows? In any case, if you made it this far, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. What more bleak albums should we look at? What else can we add to the devastating albums playlist? In any case, I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.